have encouraged, however unwittingly, in practice encouraged ignorance and prejudice in this country about coloured people, you and the Act have set the seal of official approval on every British landlady who's ever...
to cope with all the Eastern Europeans coming into the country.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected.
People talk about UKIP as being on the right. Actually, a growing number of our voters come from the left.
Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. I know it has actually been quite a long time since I uploaded a video. Let me explain myself very quickly. Today's video took me such a long time to research and script, and the reason for that was because I had this huge plan to make like this super long video essay. It was going to be like an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours, and it was basically all going to be about the rise of the right in Britain, which it still is. But basically, as I was scripting it up, I realised that it's a really stupid idea to put up a 2-hour video essay because most of you guys are used to the 30-40 minute videos. I just didn't think it would be something you'd be interested in. We have another 2-parter, everybody. Yes, we love those. So this part I'm talking briefly about neoliberalism and capitalism in the beginning, but I'm also talking about sort of the rise and the right of Britain when it comes to fascist groups in the past, immigrant groups that have been targeted, and on top of that, UKIP, the BNP and Brexit. My next video is going to be focused all on the EDL and anti-Islam culture in the UK. I was going to put it all into one video, especially with the EDL and Islamophobia. There is so much to unpack there that if I put it all into one video, this would literally be 2 hours long, and I really doubt a lot of you guys want to watch 2-hour videos. I think you'd much rather it be split up, and so do I actually, because then I'd be editing forever. And just before I do get started with today's video, I would just like to thank ExpressVPN for sponsoring today's video. If you guys don't know what a VPN is, it is a virtual private network, and when you use a VPN, all of your private data gets encrypted, which is more important now than ever, being as it is so easy to get hacked. Without a VPN, hackers can access your passwords, your financial details, and even your emails. And also, using a VPN will help keep your private data private by rerouting your connection with a different server, so your real IP address is hidden and masked with a different one. One of my personal favourite features of ExpressVPN is being able to change what country your browser thinks you're in, so you can watch YouTube videos which are blocked in your country, or my favourite, you can watch American or Canadian Netflix. In particular, I really like watching the American version of The Office on American Netflix. ExpressVPN is so easy to install and use. It has one of the fastest speeds and is one of the top VPN providers. And if you want to find out how to get 3 months ExpressVPN for free, make sure you use my link down below, which is expressvpn.com/JordanT. That is expressvpn.com/JordanT. You guys often ask ways to support my channel, and the best way to support my channel is to support my sponsors. Thank you again, ExpressVPN, for sponsoring today's video. So today's video, like I've said, is going to be the rise of the right part 1. Now, I think a lot of people are understandably under the impression that we live in a very tolerant society. I definitely think in Britain we are sort of more tolerant than ever. Just because we are more tolerant than ever does not mean that intolerance doesn't exist. You know, a lot of people say that we should be like so proud because we're such a tolerant country, but there's still a lot of racism and bigotry in this country that I don't really think it's anything to be proud of, to be honest. I remember I actually saw a tweet quite a while ago which said just because you beat your wife once a week rather than twice a week doesn't mean suddenly you're a better person. Despite the high amounts of multiculturalism in this country is still extremely racist, and I think we can tell by quite a few things, such as the counter protests to the Black Lives Matter movement, and also very recently the response to the refugee crisis and refugees trying to cross the channel to get into the UK. You know, it is really depressing to see the amount of people that just lack general sympathy. I'm going a little bit off script here, but I think when it comes to the refugee crisis, people just don't seem to see refugees as people. Like, it could so easily be you in that situation. All of this and so much more right-wing tabloids, social media, on television, it's becoming clearer and clearer that not only do we live in a pretty intolerant country, the right-wing perspective seems to be becoming more and more mainstreamed and normalised. Saying you're completely against immigration and that Britain should stay British is no longer seen as a controversial statement anymore. So that's what I want to explore in this video, the normalisation of right-wing ideology and how it has really entered the mainstream without a lot of people really noticing, how it all relates to Britain's history of anti-immigration, Britain's far-right groups, anything from the National Front to the BNP to UKIP, how all of this relates to the Brexit referendum, and how all of it really does link to neoliberalism, capitalism and the free market. So I did read 2 really good books to research for this video, so if you guys want to know more in-depth information, I'd highly recommend getting these 2 books. The first one, I've mainly used this one to research this video. It is English Uprising, Brexit and the Mainstreaming of the Far Right by Paul Stocker. This is really easy to read as well. They've put it in very simple language, so it's very easy for me to understand. And then this one I used mostly to research for the second part of this video. By the way, if you're not subscribed, make sure you do so you don't miss the second part. This is The Rise of the Right, English Nationalism and the Transformation of Working Class Politics by Simon Winlow, Steve Hall and James Treadwell. They do a lot of field research when it comes to the EDL and working class politics, so I would definitely recommend checking this book out. In my opinion, before we can even begin with talking about the rise of the far right in Britain and the scapegoating of various ethnic minorities and immigrants, the first thing we really need to talk about is the economic system in which this country is under at the moment, which is capitalism. Now, I am going to try and keep this fairly brief and simple because it is so complicated, but I will leave a few links to videos down below about capitalism, neoliberalism and the free markets if you guys want to know more about it. And I know some of you guys are probably thinking, why are you even bothering making a segment about neoliberalism if you can't even go in depth with it? Well, really, you can't really talk about the rise of the right without talking about class, and you can't really talk about class without talking about capitalism. Now, the definition of capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. And the definition of neoliberalism is a modified form of liberalism tending to favour free market capitalism. And alongside capitalism and neoliberalism, there is also globalisation. Globalisation is the process by which businesses or other organisations develop international influence or starting operation on an international scale. And when you sort of read the definition of globalisation, I don't think you really clock that it can be a bad thing, but globalisation more often than not involves businesses relocating their factories or their production lines to usually third world developing countries, where they get away with paying the workers far less to make a much larger profit. Most large businesses do this. A very big example of this is fast fashion. Before globalization, before businesses were so focused on making as much money as possible, a majority of British businesses had their factories in Britain, and these factories would be in normal towns, and a majority of people who lived in the town would work at this one factory. So this combination of neoliberalism, capitalism, the deindustrialization of Britain alongside with the industrialization of third world developing countries has left a lot of towns in Britain very economically deprived because there are no industries keeping these towns alive anymore. There's usually mass unemployment in these towns and or very low paid service sector work, and with an ever growing gap between the rich and the poor. And to be honest, the political establishment, I guess, politicians in general, tend to worsen this issue by not addressing why so many working class people's lives have changed. Most politicians have just accepted this transformation and just dismiss the fears and anxieties of working working class people as just them being a bit irrational. And in Britain, in these former industrial towns, in working class areas where a majority of people work very low paid service sector jobs, work in call centres, have temporary work, are constantly bouncing between jobs, there is a very heightened level of anxiety, there's a very heightened level of unsureness, and it's almost like something doesn't really feel right. But this feeling does go far beyond just feeling a bit unsure of yourself and just feeling like something isn't quite right. People who are really struggling in today's political climate and today's economic system have an understandably very bleak outlook on life, that they're always going to struggle, and that 20, 30, 40 years ago there was something there that is no longer there anymore, because life was good a couple decades ago, a few decades ago, and now life is bad. They feel like something has been taken away from them. A lot of the time they can't really put their finger on what. And it's strange because if you sort of take a step back and look at the world, it seems like life is better than ever. There's a ridiculous advances in technology, advances in healthcare. Countries are becoming more and more tolerant of different sexualities, ethnicities, religions, gender expression. There's widespread democracy, yet there's still this very much shared anxiety about the future. And for people who don't have the knowledge of why life has changed and they can't quite put their finger on what's wrong, the feelings that they have are very repressed. You know, we are taught to accept the world for how it is and to just get on with it really, and sort of make the best of whatever situation you're in. And on top of this, after the 2008 financial crash, there was a coalition government elected in 2010, which was between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. The Prime Minister at the time was Conservative David Cameron. Basically, the coalition government needed to find a way to sort out this problem of the 2008 financial crisis, and it seemed to be the only idea they could think of was spending cuts, was austerity, and they didn't offer the British public any other option. And economists continued to warn the government that spending cuts in a recession is never really a good idea. There was no evidence to suggest that austerity works, but there was plenty of evidence to suggest that austerity doesn't work. Because at the end of the day, spending cuts do not address the fundamental causes of the financial crash, those fundamental causes being capitalism. But the government still went ahead and implemented spending cuts anyway. This solution that they thought of to try and fix the 2008 financial crisis only affected ordinary people, and they chose austerity over any other solution because it was the only solution which didn't inconvenience the super rich of the country. And if any forms of social democracy are proposed, renationalisation of key industries, national investment banks, raising taxes for the super rich and large corporations, these are all painted as very illiberal and a slippery slope to communism. Politicians, alongside with the mainstream media, uphold this lie. The super rich existing in this country and people and corporations being super rich benefits everyone apparently. You know, if we didn't take risks in the free market, then the economy would be in tatters. All of us will eventually benefit from the wealth of the super rich. It's called the sort of trickle down effect. Eventually everyone's wealth will trickle down and class conflict will be over because we'll all share this money. I don't know who said that, but it's kind of not true. So obviously that was an extremely condensed version of why capitalism and neoliberalism is a disease. If you guys want me to actually make a whole video about why I don't really like capitalism, then I will actually do that. So let me know if you guys want to see that. I know that was so short and condensed, and I know I can already hear the comments. I'm going to be called a hypocrite because I make profit from my videos. I capitalise off of my videos technically, but because I'm in this economic system, I kind of can't help but contribute to it. There is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. Class does play a very big role in right-wing politics, in particular when it comes to the English Defence League, which I will be talking about in the second part of this video. because a lot of EDL supporters are working class and they are from deindustrialized towns. I do just want to preface that class is not always the sole factor of why people get into far-right politics. Anti-immigration sentiment has always been a running theme within Britain even before deindustrialization, and also UKIP, a far-right anti-immigration party, do have a lot of middle class and even upper class voters. So when we discuss far-right politics and intolerance, and we're talking about the BNP and the EDL and UKIP and Brexit, it's very easy to think that this is all very much a new development, when in fact Britain has an extremely long history of being extremely anti-immigration and being extremely hostile to migrants. And also I think it's quite easy anyway to forget Britain's history because Britain itself is so optimistic looking back on everything. There is no accountability in British history. In schools over here you don't really get taught about the harsh realities of British history. You don't really get taught about colonialism that much. One small example of this is not a lot of people know that Winston Churchill was a massive racist. I did not know this until less than a year ago, I think, because all British history books do is paint him as a hero that could do no wrong. Britain even has such an optimistic view of itself that in a recent British guideline to promote British values in schools, one of the British values was tolerance. And I think we need to confront this fairy tale that Britain has written for itself, that we are so tolerant and open to immigration and migrants, because racism against migrants is a reoccurring response whenever the debate of immigration gets brought up. And when we actually sit down and take a look at Britain's history with immigration and anti-immigration, you can see the way that immigrants are treated now is so similar to the way immigrants were treated 50 years ago when it comes to hostility and scapegoating. The first wave of immigration we are going to be talking about is immigration from Ireland. Before the Great Famine, it was sort of fairly common for Irish people to migrate over to Britain, but after the potato blight, there was a huge spike in Irish migrants moving over to Britain. In 1841, around 4 years before the Great Famine, approximately 420,000 Irish people lived in Britain, and within just a decade the number had doubled to approximately 734,000. Most Irish people migrating to Liverpool, Dundee and Glasgow, already impoverished areas of Britain. And very unsurprisingly, the response from Britons was very hostile. Irish people were discriminated against when it came to employment and housing, Irish accents were barred from pubs, and the British media and politicians would paint Irish people as unruly, feckless, dirty, alcoholics and untrustworthy. And a lot of working class Britons especially were very suspicious of Irish migrants because they saw them as people who they were competing for resources with. They saw them as people who were stealing their jobs, stealing their housing, and would blame Irish people for the stagnation and reduction in wages. And as Irish migration to Britain reduced, there came a gradual acceptance, but anti-Irish prejudice still existed in Britain, and the far right still continued to portray Irish migrants as racially inferior, and anti-Irish prejudice would reappear in the 1960s as the conflict in Northern Ireland began. The next group of migrants I'll be talking about who got scapegoated and extremely hostile response to moving over to the UK was Jewish migrants. In the 1880s, many, I'm going to totally mispronounce this, Ashkenazi Jews from Russian Poland had been driven out of their country due to anti-Jewish legislation. And I'm just reading this off my notes. Between 1881 to 1914, around 150,000 Jewish migrants arrived to the UK. A lot of them arrived in boats from Eastern Europe with either forged documents or no documents at all. And anti-Semitism definitely was not a new development in Britain. Anti-Semitism dates back hundreds and hundreds of years in Britain. So many of these Jewish migrants, a lot of them choosing to settle in East London, were met with hostility and even violence. They were scolded for their dirty appearance, and they were accused by workers and even some trade unions of pushing down wages, stealing jobs, and putting more pressure on low housing stock. And this wave of Jewish migration immigration led to the founding of a lot of anti-alien organisations, such as the British Brothers League, which was founded in 1902, and the British Brothers League lobbied for the end of all immigration. They believed that Britain had become the dumping ground of Europe, and the British Brothers League allegedly accumulated 45,000 members. And following the mass immigration of Jews and the founding of many far-right anti-alien organisations, lobbying done by the BBL, the government attempted to control immigration by implementing the Aliens Act of 1905. This act intended to keep out poor, homeless and diseased migrants. And even though the Jewish population in Britain was extremely small, they would still get featured in a lot of anti-immigrant and anti-foreigner campaigns. In 1945, there was a chronic labour shortage in the UK, and in order to absolve this, Clement Attlee and the Labour Party encouraged citizens from the Commonwealth to migrate over to Britain through the 1948 British Nationality Act. And most of these migrants came from the West Indies, the Caribbean and former British India. And are we all shocked? White Britain's response to this act was obviously extremely hostile, to say the least actually. Black migrants were discriminated against when it came to jobs and housing. Colour bars and segregation existed in dance halls and pubs, and negative stereotypes were of course extremely rampant. White Britons just had an extremely racist perception of black people, and I'm just reading a quote from the book. They believed they were lazy, untrustworthy savages with a voracious sexual appetite. And despite the obvious demand for workers, because there was a chronic labour shortage, these migrants which came from the Commonwealth were still accused of pushing down wages and stealing jobs. And around 1954, politicians started to become concerned with the impacts of immigration. And in the 1950s, violence and hostility towards black migrants grew even further. At this time, nearly 100,000 Caribbean people lived in London alone, mostly in impoverished areas such as Notting Hill, and people called teddy boys would just go and intimidate them, damage their property, even be violent towards them, which led to a riot in 1958 where the Caribbean community fought back, but most of it was in complete self-defense. And I think a lot of people like to blame these acts of racism on extremely small far-right groups, which I will discuss more in depth later in this video. Maybe it's out of embarrassment, maybe it's out of denial, maybe it's just the fact that Britain loves to have a ridiculously optimistic look on its history, but racism was a problem in wider society. It wasn't just exclusive to extremely small far-right groups. And the government began imposing more immigration laws because of public outcry about immigration. One of these policies being the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, and as you can guess by the name, this largely impacted non-white migrants. Around 300,000 migrants had arrived in 10 years by 1961, and this caused a lot of hostility amongst white Britons, and instead of the government nipping this problem at the bud and attempting to tackle racism and intolerance amongst the British public, they just decided to implement more immigration rules, almost trying to prove that they had a control over immigration. And the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962 was specifically designed to reduce non-white immigration. If you wanted to immigrate from South Asia or the West Indies, you would have to either have a specialised skill or a job lined up. This was due to a new work vouchers system, and on top of that, Commonwealth migrants could be deported if they were convicted of certain offences, and also the act did not address family reunification. And despite a majority of respondents not actually being affected by immigration, 13% of respondents said that they lived in an area which had many immigrants, the act actually had 70% support and 13% opposition. And the problem is, with the introduction of this act, it was basically the government confirming to the British public that immigration was a problem and that they wanted to fix it, when in fact immigration was never a problem because there was a chronic labour shortage in the UK. And on top of this, Conservative MP Peter Griffiths, I'm gonna have to read this off my laptop because I literally literally cannot say this for the life of me, was elected for the Birmingham seat of Smethwick in 1964. Now bear in mind that Smethwick had been a Labour seat since 1918, and the reason for Peter Griffith's election was because the Conservative Party heavily featured anti-immigration in their campaigning before the vote. And all this is weird because Smethwick didn't even have high levels of immigration, so Peter Griffith's anti-immigration campaign was vile to say the least. The campaign slogan being, "If you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour." And this campaign slogan was handed out on leaflets, and obviously it was criticised, and Griffiths denied any involvement in making the leaflet, but he still refused to criticise it or denounce it. And even Harold Wilson's Labour government, who were openly against the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, still proceeded to implement further immigration controls, which the public really approved of, such as reducing work vouchers. And in a 1967 Gallup poll, the most popular reasons that the British public opposed of specifically non-white immigration was 49% believed they would be supported by welfare, 41% believed they would congregate in a neighbourhood and turn it into a slum, 36% believed they had different habits and customs, and 30% believed they took jobs from the British. Now, let's talk about Enoch Powell. If you guys don't know who Enoch Powell is, he was a Conservative MP of Wolverhampton South West in 1950. He was the Health Secretary between 1960 and 1963, and during this time as Health Secretary, Enoch Powell actually encouraged nurses from the Commonwealth to come and work for the NHS. But in 1968, Powell would become most well known for his rivers of blood speech. There is a racial slur in there, and I'm not going to say it because I don't feel comfortable with that, but I will put a censored version on the screen so you guys know what I'm talking about. Basically, this whole speech was against immigration from the Commonwealth, despite Enoch Powell encouraging nurses from the Commonwealth to come and work for the NHS, but whatever. He shared the alleged incident about a pensioner who had experienced excretia pushed through her letterbox and had been stalked by wide grinning. And he also said, "In this country, in 15 or 20 years, time the black man will have whip over the white man." Powell also denounced the Race Relations Bill, claiming that it would be used to discriminate against white Britons. It's actually quite difficult to find this speech online. There is no full version of the speech, there's only sort of the speech with commentary over it. Understandably, the speech did cause a lot of controversy and uproar. Enoch Powell was actually sacked from his position as Shadow Defence Secretary, but surprisingly, a majority of the country actually agreed with what he was saying somehow. He received over 120,000 letters of support, and over 1,000 East London dockers protested and marched after he was fired. Leader of the UKIP party, Nigel Farage, who actually describes Enoch Powell as one of his political heroes, believes that the rivers of blood speech was extremely important because apparently Enoch Powell was talking about immigration when everyone else was too afraid to do so. In response to public concern over immigration, Ted Heath implemented some of the harshest immigration controls that Britain had ever seen. The 1971 Immigration Act, which intended to end primary immigration from the Commonwealth, with temporary work permits instead of work vouchers, and these temporary work permits often favoured immigrants from Canada and Australia and New Zealand, white immigrants. And surprisingly, Heath's policy actually wasn't that successful in reducing immigration. Immigration throughout the 1970s sort of continued at a similar rate of around 200,000 people per year, mostly driven by family reunification from South Asia, but also the government admitted 27,000 Asian people who were expelled from Uganda on humanitarian grounds. In the late 1980s and 1990s, there seemed to be a spike of hostility against asylum seekers and refugees. If you guys don't know, the UK is very dominated by right-wing tabloids, some of the most popular newspapers being The Sun, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. And a majority of ordinary people will especially read The Sun and the Daily Mail without even realising that it is biased or that it is very sensationalised. And the British press has always shown disdain towards asylum seekers, almost portraying them as liars, that they aren't really fleeing from war-torn countries, that they're actually just using it to get over here illegally. And in the 1990s, there was actually an increase of the amount of refugees in the world. It went up to around 17 million. And because of this, applications of asylum in Britain actually sort of began to increase from 1995. In 1996, there was approximately 30,000 applications for asylum in the UK, and applications peaked in 2002 with around 84,000, which the Labour government at the time responded to by putting extreme restrictions on the asylum system, so this quickly dropped in 2005 to around 25,000. And what truly heightened the public's fear of asylum seekers was the right-wing tabloids' portrayal of the asylum system, claiming that it was completely out of control. Between January 2000 and January 2006, 8,163 articles in The Sun, The Daily Mail and The Daily Express featured the word asylum seeker. That's just under 4 per day. And you know, within the immigration debate, people would often zoom their focus in on asylum seekers and refugees, when in reality asylum seekers and refugees only made up 4% of inward immigration at that time. And this hysteria created by right-wing tabloids about refugees and asylum seekers really did affect the public's perception of how this country treats asylum. In a 2002 Morai survey, respondents believed on average that the UK hosted 23% of the world's asylum seekers, when the accurate figure is actually 1.98%. So this mass hysteria is making the British public overestimate how many asylum seekers are actually in this country. And right-wing tabloids would make all sorts of ludicrous and disgusting claims about refugees and asylum seekers, one of them being that they were bringing over all sorts of tropical diseases and HIV and AIDS. There was even articles about refugees intentionally spreading HIV and AIDS as a form of biological GBH, despite there being little to no evidence of refugees and asylum seekers even bringing over disease with them. Asylum seekers would regularly be referred to as illegal immigrants, even though a majority of them were in the country legally. They would be painted as terrorists and violent criminals and thieves. Papers often publishing individual crimes of individual asylum seekers, attempting to paint all asylum seekers in these ways. And a lot of British people actually don't really know what asylum seekers are entitled to when they arrive to this country. The reality is that asylum seekers are entitled to just over £36 a week, and only £10 of that can be converted into cash. The rest is given in vouchers which they can only spend in specific shops. The reality is that a majority of asylum seekers continue to live in poverty when they arrive in this country. In 2000, 43% of the British public believed that asylum seekers and refugees were actually economic migrants that were essentially lying their way into the country. And just 3 years prior to that, in 1997, only 11% of the British public believed this. A lot of Britons believe that asylum seekers choose to apply for asylum in the UK because apparently Britain has a soft touch, even though there is really little evidence to suggest that Britain has soft touch in the first place. And on top of this, there is very little evidence to show that asylum seekers know the British asylum system through and through. Most asylum seekers actually want to work, and most asylum seekers choose to move to the UK because they either already know English or they want to learn English. Nowadays, the anti-immigration sentiment is aimed at all immigrants. The most recently scapegoated immigrants seem to be Eastern Europeans and Muslims, but I will be getting into that later, and I will be getting into the Islamophobic sentiment in my part 2 of this video. And the reason I'm choosing to elaborate on Eastern European migration later in this video is because Eastern European migration and Islamophobia is very relevant to UKIP and Brexit, and I did just want to explain the pattern of hostility towards immigrants in the UK for the last 200 years. let's talk about Britain's history of far-right fascist groups. The early 1900s is when most of Britain's first fascist groups began to be founded. The British fascists were founded in 1923 and amassed around 30,000 members. Arnold Leese, who was a former member of the British fascists, actually ended up founding the Imperial Fascist League in 1929, which was actually a lot less successful than the British fascists. And it's very important to note that far-right politics at this time in the early 1900s was very paranoid and was very much based a lot of their ideology on conspiracy theories. In 1932, former Labour Party Minister Sir Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists. Mosley was a self-proclaimed socialist, and I'm just going to read this out. I do apologise that I keep having to read directly from my notes, but this is literally the hardest script I've ever written. Who wanted to implement economically nationalist and protectionist policies to enhance British manufacturing and help the working class. Just 18 months after the BUF had been founded, it actually managed to amass over 40,000 members. But the BUF had an extremely violent image that they couldn't shake off. The BUF began being more openly violent, more openly anti-Semitic, and even provoking violence against British Jews. The BUF's director of propaganda was actually A.K. Chesterton, who would later go on to found the National Front in 1967, and he often spoke of the reeking corruption of Jew. And obviously after World War II and the Holocaust, these far-right fascist parties would find it a lot harder to implement their ideas, put their ideas out there and put them in the mainstream. Hence why you'll rarely see fascists call themselves fascists after the Second World War. But the Second World War did not stop far-right fascist groups from forming, the British League of Ex-Servicemen being one of them. The BLXS were highly anti-Semitic and would purposely go out onto the streets of East London to purposely terrorise and attack Jewish people. In 1948, the BLXS actually joined with Oswald Mosley, who was the founder of the British Union of Fascists, and together they would regularly attack the Jewish population, use the events in Palestine as a way to justify Nazi crimes and just anti-Semitism in general, and were also even sceptical if the Holocaust happened at all. The reason I'm mentioning all of these early 1900s fascist groups is because over the last century it has become more and more unacceptable to be openly racist and openly anti-Semitic, meaning that far-right groups have had to adapt their language and their political communication to try and appear less openly bigoted to try and sway people on their side. In the 1950s, the far-right was very dominated by sort of a few very small and sort of sceptical far-right organisations who based a lot of their ideology on conspiracy theories. One of them being the League of Empire Loyalists, which was founded in 1953 by A.K. Chesterton. The LEL were actually disgusted by Nazi war crimes, but were still very openly anti-Semitic and believed in a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The LEL sort of just shows the nationalist and xenophobic politics continuing into the 1950s. The LEL was the most popular far-right organisation of that time. It had around 3,000 active members, one of them being John Tyndall, which is a very important name to remember because he would go on to be chairman of the National Front and found the BNP. Other LEL members were also Martin Webster, who would be the future leader of the National Front, and also Colin Jordan, who would become quite a well-known figure in Britain's neo-Nazi movement. And this is why it's so important to like go back and look on all of these fascist groups, because as you can see, I keep saying this person would go on to found this and to join this and to do this. All of these fascist groups are extremely interlinked with one another, and a lot of these far-right groups were not successful after the Second World War because they were being overtly fascist. And when people think of fascism, they think of Hitler, and a lot of people surprisingly don't like Hitler. But just because people oppose Nazism and fascism doesn't mean that people aren't racist. Just because someone is anti-fascist doesn't mean that they are tolerant. A small but extreme neo-Nazi culture started to develop in England in the 1960s. They believed that Jewish people played an extremely big role in non-white migration to the UK, and again in another example of how far-right politics at this time was very based on conspiracy. But neo-Nazism did play a role in the development of far-right politics and far-right organisations. John Tyndall left the League of Empire Loyalists to form the National Labour Party, not to get mixed up with the Labour Party, by the way. And he formed the National Labour Party with John Bean, and they would merge with another far-right organisation, the White Defence League, which was founded by Colin Jordan. Despite hostility towards immigration being fairly common at this time, far-right organisations were still split into very small groups, and a lot of people who were into far-right politics started to realise that they sort of needed to pool their resources almost and join all together to try and get votes and make some sort of political impact. A.K. Chesterton and John Bean would go on to form the National Front in 1967, which would go on to be the most successful far-right organisation after the First World War. And the way they would do this is they would exploit the public's fear of immigration. Sorry if this looks ever so slightly different. I'm actually filming this on a different day. Filming of this video has been a disaster, but we moved. It's also worth noting that John Tyndall, who formed the National Labour Party with John Bean, would not be involved in the formation of the National Front due to his extreme background of being a literal Nazi, but he would still go on to join the National Front very quietly in 1967. The National Front was formed of far-right extremists, Nazis who didn't believe in democracy, and also far-right conservatives who did believe in democracy but at the same time were white supremacists and very anti-immigration. In 1972, John Tyndall actually became chairman of the National Front, which did cause a little bit of unrest in the party just because a lot of people didn't really like him. But because of public uproar over the admittance of Ugandan Asian refugees on humanitarian grounds, the National Front membership actually spiked at this point to around 17,500. The National Front's performance in local elections was actually quite good. By 1974, they actually had over 30 branches and 54 groups across the whole country. But their performance in local elections was very different to their performance in general elections, which was mediocre to say the least. John Tyndall was actually replaced as chairman for a short while by John Kingsley Reid. This was because of Tyndall's background of being a Nazi, so they thought that having Kingsley Reid as the National Front leader would be a little bit more moderate, I guess. But John Tyndall would resume his place as chairman after Kingsley Reid gave an extremely disturbing speech in 1975. Now, there are slurs in this speech, and as I've said before, I don't really feel comfortable saying those, so I am going to put a censored version of the slur on the screen. He said inflammatory statements such as, "I'm told I cannot refer to coloured immigrants, so you will forgive me if I refer to N-words," and in reference to the murder of Asian youth Singh Chagar, he responded with, "One N-word stabbed another N-word. Very unfortunate. That's one down, 1 million to go." The National Front would not go on to be a very successful far-right party because they just couldn't shake off their neo-Nazi, fascist and extremist image, which is not appealing at all to a majority of the country. And the National Front would also almost be rendered useless after Margaret Thatcher addressed immigration problems in her 1979 Conservative Manifesto. So the one thing that the National Front had to somewhat appeal to the public was already addressed by a mainstream party, so people would much rather vote Conservative than National Front. This isn't to give credit to Margaret Thatcher or the Conservative Party for the demise of the National Front, by the way. But John Tyndall, chairman of the National Front, would go on to form the British National Party, which I'll elaborate more in just a moment. I have spoken about the BNP on my channel before. The BNP stands for the British National Party. They completely reject multiracialism, multiculturalism, non-white immigrants, and want to withdraw from the European community. Now, the BNP did actually receive some local support. BNP MP Derek Beacon actually won a chair in the Tower Hamlet Council, but the BNP wouldn't really go any further than just local support. The reason for this was because John Tyndall just failed to adapt to an anti-Nazi, anti-fascist society. He couldn't shake off his neo-Nazi or his extremist image or even attempt to hide it because he would see it as him being a sellout. By the way, I forgot to say the BNP was founded in 1982. After the BNP failed to succeed beyond local elections because of John Tyndall's very extremist image, they decided to elect Nick Griffin as the leader in an attempt to almost overhaul and cleanse their image. They wanted to be populist, family friendly, focus on local issues, but also focus on immigration, but it not be the only focus, but still a big focus. In particular, the BNP would target their policies at the white working class because essentially New Labour had abandoned the working class altogether. The BNP basically wanted to take advantage of this whole new pool of swing voters by telling them that they are victims of the political establishment and that they are also victims of anti-white racism. And the BNP, instead of changing their core fascist and Nazi ideologies, they just attempted to abstract them, sort of blur them a little bit, change the way they present themselves, the language they use, the way they present their ideas, to just make it seem like common sense. The decision to have Nick Griffin as the leader was quite an odd one, to say the least. Nick Griffin had joined the National Front as a teenager and he was a well-known Holocaust denier, but he was also very well known for adapting his political ideology to fit whatever was popular in the far-right political movement at the time. And because of this, a lot of people thought Nick Griffin was a careerist. What I personally think is the strangest thing about Nick Griffin being elected as the BNP leader is the fact that he does not have a single grain of charisma in his body. He's very bumbly, he doesn't really know how to hold himself properly, he's very uncharismatic, very unrelatable, borderlining on unlikable. He kind of comes across as a bit shady, a little bit untrustworthy, and if you want to try and appeal your far-right ideas to the general public, you need to have not only a likeable personality, but you have to have a lot of charisma. Hence why Nigel Farage has been so successful, but I will elaborate more on that later. And at this time, immigration in the UK was actually on a dramatic increase, and along with this dramatic increase came an increase in public hostility and concern. And as the BNP started to gain a bit more popularity, they started gaining more local council seats, the British media actually started to pay attention to them. But what's really strange is despite right-wing tabloids constantly condemning immigration and multiculturalism, their perception of the BNP was actually really negative. Conservative columnist Peter Hitchens even described the BNP as a functioning Nazi party, and the BNP had their most successful performance yet in the 2003 local elections. They didn't win any seats in European Parliament, but they did pick up 13 council seats. They gained around 750,000 votes, which is just over 17% of the vote share. And the BNP gained even more support after 9/11 because there was such a large increase of Islamophobia in the UK. So in areas with high Asian populations such as Oldham and Burnley, there had been a real spike in racial tension between white and Asian inhabitants. But the British media still gave the BNP very negative coverage, the Daily Express even running an explicitly anti-BNP campaign. But this negative coverage didn't really make a difference to the BNP's performance, because despite these right-wing tabloids criticising the BNP, at the same time they were benefiting the BNP through their relentless and xenophobic criticisms of migration. And the country and government's relationship with immigration would take quite a sharp turn in 2004. Before then, Tony Blair was very pro-economic immigration. At that time, the New Labour Party were very proud of Britain's multiculturalism, not only to sort of adapt to the country's cultural makeup, but also to prove they were more progressive than the out-of-touch Conservatives. In 2004, 8 former communist parties would go on to join the European Union. Those countries being Czechia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia. And because of freedom of movement, these citizens could come and migrate over to the UK if they wished. New Labour still celebrated economic migration while simultaneously placing more restrictions on the asylum system, but the government did underestimate how many people they thought were going to migrate over to here from these new EU member states. They predicted around 13,000 per year from these new states would come and migrate over to the UK. In reality, between May 2004 2004 and June 2005, over 230,000 people from these new EU member states had already migrated over to the UK, making this period the largest influx of immigration in British history. Migrants from Poland did gain a reputation of being extremely hardworking, but despite this, there was still extremely negative portrayals of them within right-wing media, a lot of them claiming that migrants from Poland were creating an alien invasion. And with this spike in migration came even more negative attitudes to migration. In 2011, 51% of the public believed that immigration had a negative economic impact, and 48% believed it had a negative cultural impact. And alongside negative attitudes towards economic migration growing, panic over asylum seekers still continued despite the vast majority of immigrants not being refugees or asylum seekers. For decades, the far right has always seen the mainstream media as its enemy, and despite a lot of right-wing tabloids' heavy criticisms of the BNP, they were still fueling the demand for anti-immigration politics. The BNP would be nowhere near as successful as it was if it wasn't for right-wing tabloids' hysteria over anti-immigration. And I'm just going to read a quote from the book by Dr. Aurélie Mondon, I've 100% mispronounced that, about the term mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is not just the BNP becoming more mainstream and changing their strategy. It is also the mainstream changing and accepting things that were not acceptable. You can't have the far-right mainstreaming itself without mainstream helping it at the same time. In the 2006 local elections, the BNP would perform the best it's ever had by picking up 33 council seats and having just over 19% of the vote share. The main reason for this was because the vote happened quite shortly after the 7/7 bombings. The BNP exploited this terrorist attack and used opposition against Islam as one of their main campaigning issues. And at this time, the mainstream media ramped up their criticism towards the BNP even more out of fear that they would win seats in the European Parliament. And also at this time, there was widespread abuse of the expenses system by MPs and the House of Lords. And the BNP used this situation to try and get votes by saying that they were going against the political establishment. So if you vote for the BNP, you're not voting for the political establishment who abused their finances. And in 2009, very surprisingly, the BNP won 2 seats in European Parliament, whilst continuing to condemn the government for allowing mass immigration. The public and the media were actually expecting the BNP to do pretty well in the 2010 general election. They weren't expecting them to win or anything, but they did expect the BNP to pick up a few seats, especially because the BNP were choosing to focus on Eastern European migration at this time, which was causing, again, a lot of public hostility and unrest. But the BNP actually only polled 2% nationally. They didn't even come close to winning 1 seat. And after this, the BNP slowly started to go on a decline. The party was split after former neo-Nazi and member Andrew Brons left. The finances of the party were an absolute mess. And before the 2015 general election, Nick Griffin was expelled from the party. But we must not mistake this for some success of the left. The BNP's failure was not a success for left-wingers, because the BNP would never succeed because they just had too much fascist baggage. But the BNP's small successes just showed that Britain was becoming more prejudiced, more xenophobic and more racist, and more angry because they couldn't make the connection between their lives declining with capitalism, deindustrialisation, globalisation, neoliberalism, etc. So the only connection they could make in their heads was their lives were getting bad because immigration was increasing. Now let's talk about UKIP. Dr. Alan Sked would found the Anti-Federalist League and quickly rebrand it to the United Kingdom Independence Party in 1993. UKIP began as a single issue party which solely focused on the UK's membership to the European Union. For a good few years, UKIP did not have that much success at all because the whole party just couldn't agree on an electoral strategy. But they did have a few small successes. In 1999, they picked up 3 seats in European Parliament and had around 7% of the national vote vote share, and throughout this they still remained a single issue party. And at around 2009, UKIP began to focus on immigration as an issue rather than just leaving the European Union, but at this time they were very much overshadowed by the BNP. UKIP was very quick to separate themselves from the BNP because understandably people started comparing them because they are very similar. UKIP leader Nigel Farage even saying, "We have nothing in common with the BNP. They are racist, we are inclusive." But I don't think a lot of people realise that without UKIP and UKIP's success, the EU referendum probably would have ended very differently. UKIP successfully mainstreamed xenophobia and anti-immigration by not making their party seem extremist or fascist to the general public, and they used the issue of immigration to sway the public's opinion on Brexit. Despite UKIP claiming they weren't racist, their party members displayed bigoted and racist behaviour on multiple occasions, and they would often just pass off this behaviour as not being politically correct. In 2013, MEP Godfrey Bloom referred to countries which received foreign aid as Bongo Bongo land and was thrown out of European Parliament for shouting "Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer" at Martin Schulz, a socialist German leader. Bloom ended up leaving UKIP in 2014. And UKIP MEP Janice Atkinson referred to a UKIP supporter's wife as Ting Tong from somewhere. She was expelled from the party in 2015 for expenses fraud. And the British public were becoming more hesitant about the European Union after the accession of the A8 countries in 2004, alongside with the Eurozone crisis and the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. So UKIP decided to capitalise on this doubt that the British public had. The BNP had successfully radicalised some of the white working class to anti-immigration politics, so half the work for UKIP was already done. UKIP would often go for ex-BNP voters, or they would go for people who wanted to vote for the BNP but it just felt a little bit like morally they didn't feel right. So UKIP presented themselves as a non-racist alternative to the BNP. UKIP started to gain some popularity in the 2012 by-elections, mainly because they were seen as one of the only parties that addressed the problem of immigration, and voting for UKIP was also seen as rebelling against traditional political parties and the political establishment. UKIP voters tended to be less educated, more economically vulnerable and older. And if some of you guys aren't from the UK and don't know, UKIP is very well known for its leader Nigel Farage. You can't really talk about UKIP without talking about Nigel Farage, and you can't really talk about Nigel Farage without talking about UKIP. If I'm going to be completely honest, most of UKIP's success does come down to Nigel Farage. He claimed he wanted to talk directly to the people about things which the political establishment ignored, such as immigration. Farage was almost seen as an ordinary man, despite the fact that he was actually extremely privileged. He smoked cigarettes, he drank beer, he didn't use a lot of political jargon, he sort of spoke like a normal person, and he refused to be politically correct, which I think is what a lot of people, especially older people in the UK, kind of relate to. A lot of people genuinely related to him, which was quite strange, especially a lot of the working class related to him, being as he was very dedicated to upholding the free market. He wanted to shrink taxes for corporations and the super rich, and he also believed in austerity. So if the working class were going to vote for Nigel Farage, they were really voting against their class interests. UKIP was actually so successful that it was even seen as a successful adoption of radical right-wing populism. Radical right-wing populism is very authoritarian and it's very nativist. If you guys don't know what nativism is, it basically means that national interest should be the top priority, but often nativism goes hand in hand with xenophobia and antagonism towards outsiders. And authoritarianism is the belief that society should be so strictly ordered that anyone who doesn't want to fit in this order should be punished. And also authoritarian societies are very anti-crime and believe that criminals should be punished very strictly. And populism is the belief that society ultimately is divided into two groups. The people, who are just ordinary people, and the out-of-touch elite. And populism believes that politics should be guided by the people. And populism does sound good in theory, but because of the lack of education about neoliberalism and capitalism and how damaging it is, a lot of people blame their problems on immigrants rather than the economic system. Populism is seen more as a political style nowadays rather than just an ideology, mainly because a lot of right-wing populist parties use the same political tactics. One of those very popular tactics is having a very charismatic and borderlining on flamboyant leader who claims that they are a voice for the ordinary people and that they are against the political establishment. They talk how normal people talk, like I've said before, no sort of political jargon, and they address issues which don't often get addressed. They address very taboo topics such as immigration, multiculturalism and Islam. And similarly to the BNP, they frame their very xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant sentiment as just common sense. The far right often puts a lot of emphasis on identity, in particular British identity, and that's why they don't really agree with multiculturalism, because they believe that multiculturalism somehow threatens British identity. It somehow threatens the norms, the traditions and the values of British society. UKIP choosing an anti-establishment strategy was actually extremely successful. People were becoming less and less trustworthy of the political elite. People were becoming less trustworthy of politicians anyway, you know, such as the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So voter volatility was really increasing and the amount of swing voters was really increasing also. So UKIP decided to capitalise on this new pool of voters who didn't really know who they wanted to vote for, if they wanted to even vote for anyone. But it wasn't just UKIP's strategy and leader which led to their success, but it was also British media and British politicians making anti-refugee and anti-immigration the centre of politics. And on top of this, David Cameron, who was Conservative Prime Minister between 2010 and 2016, was becoming more and more unpopular amongst the British public, mostly because he promised to crack down on immigration, saying that it was a problem, confirming to the British public that it was a problem, yet didn't actually do anything to crack down on it. And on top of that, David Cameron was also very well known for constantly implementing austerity policies. And definitely politicians' responses to immigration is where this problem lies, and it's where this problem really began. When politicians were confronted with the public rallying against immigration, instead of reassuring, hey, immigration actually isn't a bad thing, they just implemented more immigration controls, etc., therefore confirming to the British public that it is a problem. Now, there were increasing immigrants entering the country, this isn't a lie, but instead of saying to the British public, this is fine, immigrants aren't the cause for unemployment and poverty, instead they just said, it's a bad thing, and we're going to stop it. And because they were doing very little to stop it, because they did confirm that it was a problem, even though it isn't, this gave UKIP and Nigel Farage the perfect opportunity to gain popularity and votes. And I just have to read out a few figures. By May 2011, public opinion on immigration was more hostile than ever. A YouGov poll found that 68% of people were concerned that Britain was losing its own culture, and 73% believed that Britain is already overcrowded, and 69% of respondents would vote in favour of reducing net migration to zero. Now, this myth that Britain has no more room is a myth. We already have a very declining population due to a decrease in birth rates, and on top of this, a majority of Britain is rural, and also the belief that immigrants steal jobs and that immigrants put too much pressure on the welfare system can't actually be proved. The only evidence that people provide for this argument is anecdotal. And of course, like I've said, immigration has sharply increased in this country. There is absolutely no denying that. Between 1995 to 2015, the number of immigrants arriving to the UK from the EU did triple. But Jonathan Portes of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research found between 2004 to 2012 the impact of migration on wages of semi-skilled jobs has been around 1%. And the fact of the matter is, it is widely accepted amongst mainstream economists that immigration provides more economic benefits than costs. Any sort of falls in wages were mostly due to the 2008 financial crisis. And also EU migrants tended to be educated, younger, more likely to be in work and less likely to claim benefits than UK born. And EU immigrants actually contributed more in tax than they took out. And another immigrant group that UKIP decided to close in on was Romanians and Bulgarians after Romania and Bulgaria joined the EU in 2008. The British media often portrayed Romanians as dirty, unruly and disease-ridden, and similarly to how refugees were scapegoated in the early 2000s, the Daily Express claimed that Romanians were going to bring over HIV into the UK. Between December 2012 and December 2013, 19 national newspapers in Britain published over 4,000 articles and letters relating to just Romanians and Bulgarians alone. That is an average of just under 11 per day. And a majority of these articles focused on crime and antisocial behaviour, the most common words featured in these articles being criminal, beggar, gang, thief and squatter. And in the 2013 by-election, UKIP candidate Diane James decided to exploit the public's fear, I guess, of Romanian immigration by claiming that Romanians entering the country was going to put unprecedented pressure on public services and also would lead to a sharp increase in crime due to Romanian gangs pickpocketing. And just a year after this by-election, Nigel Farage claimed that London was experiencing a Romanian crime wave, yet had little to no evidence to actually back this statement up. And this alleged Romanian invasion that was going to happen, that Nigel Farage and the British media were scaremongering the public about, never actually happened. In 2014, only 22,000 Romanians and Bulgarians migrated over to the UK. And despite such a minuscule amount of Romanians and Bulgarians migrating over to the UK, Farage still continued to use Romanian immigration to scaremonger the public, and even used it in the 2014 European elections. And I think a huge contributing factor to Farage and UKIP's success was, despite Farage condemning immigration every single day, he somehow managed to dodge and avoid any accusations of extremism or racism. And this is something which the BNP couldn't do. And also what is so strange about UKIP's rise is, despite the similarities between UKIP and the BNP, the way the British media treated UKIP could not have been any more different to the way that they treated the BNP. UKIP and Nigel Farage were treated as a breath of fresh air. Nigel Farage and the UKIP party were treated as a party that were addressing things that the political establishment were ignoring. The Daily Express even endorsed UKIP in 2014, whilst other tabloids continued to publish anti-immigration stories which basically confirmed UKIP's message. Farage was also given a very large platform on television, which was never really seen before. Nigel Farage appeared on BBC's Question Time 31 times by 2017, making him the 11th most regular panel member. And that's what the British media did. They normalised this extremely hard stance on immigration, so Farage was able to avoid being called a fascist or an extremist. UKIP won just under 3.9 million votes in the 2015 general election. They did only get one seat though because of Britain's electing system. If we had a proportional electoral system, they would have gotten around 80 votes, but because Britain does first past the post, they only got one. A lot of notable Islam terrorist attacks occurred in 2015, which led to the further scapegoating of Muslims. And because some of these terrorists had arrived in Europe as asylum seekers, the British media, alongside with some politicians, used this to further scapegoat refugees and give refugees a bad name. The civil war in Syria has been one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. It's left millions of people displaced and millions of people looking to flee to another country for safety. In 2015, migration to Europe by sea had increased quite a lot, which really divided Europe into countries who wanted to welcome refugees and countries that wanted to metaphorically shut the door. And Nigel Farage's opinion on refugees was very similar to how the British media handled the asylum panic in the early 2000s, not only pushing the narrative that refugees were future or potential terrorists, but also that refugees weren't actually refugees, they weren't actually fleeing from anything. Now let's talk about Brexit. Oh, if you guys don't know what Brexit is, in 2016 there was a referendum held over here in the UK and the British public could vote to either either leave the European Union or stay in the European Union. At the moment we are in a transition period to leave. I think we officially leave in January, but obviously everything's up in the air at the moment. It was such a long time ago that I actually wasn't even old enough to vote when it happened. I was still in school when the EU referendum happened. That's how long ago it was. Because right-wing political culture alongside with anti-immigration sentiment and xenophobia had been really brewing in the UK over the last 20 years specifically, it was inevitable that immigration was going to be central to the Brexit debate. I think what a lot of people fail to believe is that if there was no anti-immigration sentiment in this country, if there was no xenophobia in this country, I really doubt that we would have voted to leave the EU, to be honest. Brexit is easily the greatest political achievement of the far right. So when people started discussing the referendum, people obviously focused on the economy first, and the Leave campaign, the politicians that were campaigning to leave the EU, they realised that they really weren't going to win with this one, so they very quickly swept that problem aside and decided to focus solely on immigration. Of course, Nigel Farage did contribute heavily to the Leave campaign, but it was mostly led by actually two Conservative MPs, Boris Johnson, who is now our Prime Minister, and Michael Gove. Both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove condemned David Cameron for not cracking down on immigration enough. The Leave campaign linked immigration with terrorism, that immigration was a drain on the welfare system and public services, and also used the refugee crisis as a way to condemn the EU, even though this isn't really valid because the UK is actually exempt from EU asylum rules. The Leave campaign also used the possibility of Turkey joining the EU as a way to scaremonger the public about a new wave of Turkish immigration. And I'm just going to read this out of my notes. Basically, there was a leaflet which showed a map of countries set to join the EU. Again, they were all coloured in red. All the other countries were greyed out except for Iraq and Syria, which were shaded in pink. This was clearly designed to link freedom of movement with Turkey, a Muslim country, as well as Iraq and Syria, fellow Muslim countries, which had seen untold turmoil and were home to ISIS. The Leave campaign also claimed that Britain's new border would be with Iraq and Syria, and that if Turkey were to join the EU, they would bring over a new wave of crime and death. Obviously, this is extremely Islamophobic. The only reason they decided to focus on these countries was because they were Muslim countries. And on top of this, there was the infamous Breaking Point poster. I'll pop a picture of it on the screen now, which showed a large line of Muslim refugees crossing through Slovenia into Croatia. Clearly, Leave campaign were trying to imply that Britain would be swamped with refugees if we stayed in the EU. I just want to repeat this, the whole refugee crisis is a redundant argument because the UK is exempt from EU asylum rules. And the same day this poster was unveiled, Remain campaigner and MP Jo Cox was shot, stabbed and killed by an extreme right terrorist called Thomas Mayer, who allegedly shouted "Put Britain first" as he attacked her. The Spectator's Alex Massey wrote in an article, "When you shout breaking point over and over again, you don't get to be surprised when someone breaks. When you present politics as a matter of life and death, as a question of national survival, don't be surprised if someone takes your word. At some point, in some place, something or someone is going to snap." And just under a week after Jo Cox's murder, the UK voted to leave the EU, and Nigel Farage celebrated this success and claimed that Brexit had been achieved without having to fight, without a single bullet fired. When it came to areas which had the highest amount of Leave voters, it tended to be very economically deprived, deindustrialised towns. If you guys want to know more about deindustrialisation, I recommend checking out my demonisation of the working class video. I'll put the link down below. But basically, towns which are now economically deprived, that used to have industries that were booming, that gave the towns quite a bit of money, where all the people in the towns would work for this one industry. And basically after deindustrialisation, all these industries got shut down, life has changed quite drastically, quite badly. And a lot of people in these towns can't really put their finger on why this has happened. So when a politician like Nigel Farage pops up on your TV and he's talking to you like a normal person and he's explaining to you this has happened to you because of immigration, because we are in the EU, you can't really be surprised that people will believe it. And because there was a very sharp increase in immigration, a lot of people think that that is the only thing that has changed over the last 30-40 years. And people did believe that the only way that they could improve their lives was by voting to leave the EU. And it is inevitable if you repeat this over and over and over again, and people who don't really know about capitalism or neoliberalism or deindustrialisation or globalisation, people are going to believe it. And a lot of people did see Brexit as an anti-establishment vote also. Part 1's done, baby. Part 1 is done. Part 2 will be coming very, very soon, I promise. I will not be away for as long as I was ever again. But yes, I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you did. Make sure you subscribe for part 2, and I will talk to you guys very soon. Goodbye.